December 19, 1944. The Ardennes lay buried under a cruel winter sky. Snow muffled every sound, turning the forest into a white labyrinth of frozen trees. The temperature fell below freezing, breath crystallized in the air, and frostbitten hands clutched rifles that had already seen too many battles. On the map, Bastogne was just another Belgian town, a modest crossroads with narrow streets and stone houses. But in December 1944, it became the eye of a storm. German armor closed in from every direction, choking the roads, cutting supply lines, and sealing the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne inside a tightening circle. Inside the town, weary men dug shallow foxholes in frozen ground. Medical tents overflowed. Ammunition ran thin and food was scarce. Each night the horizon glowed red as shells crashed against the outskirts. Yet the order remained the same: hold Bastogne. For the German High Command it was unthinkable. For the paratroopers it was non-negotiable. Against all logic they braced for the storm, surrounded on every side, determined not to yield. The story of Bastogne was about to begin. The Ardennes. A vast stretch of forest and rolling hills, quiet and remote, had long been considered a poor battlefield. Its narrow, twisting roads and dense trees seemed to make it unsuitable for large-scale operations. That assumption had already been shattered in 1940, when German panzers stormed through it during the invasion of France. By late 1944, as the Allies pushed toward Germany, many commanders once again believed the Ardennes sector was a backwater, thinly defended, unimportant, unlikely to see major combat. But Adolf Hitler saw it differently. After the crushing defeats of Normandy and the Allied advance across France, the German Reich was in retreat. By December 1944, the Allies were pressing at Germany's western borders. Hitler knew his nation lacked the manpower and resources for prolonged defense. A bold stroke was required, something to divide the Allies, shock their morale, and perhaps force negotiations. That stroke became the Ardennes Offensive, what the Allies would call the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's plan was audacious. More than 200,000 German troops, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns, would smash through the thinly held Ardennes sector. Their target was the Meuse River and beyond it the port of Antwerp. By seizing Antwerp, the Germans hoped to cripple Allied logistics and split the British from the Americans. The scale of the German preparation was astonishing, given their dire state. Hidden by thick forests and aided by winter fog, they assembled three massive armies. On the northern flank stood the 6th Panzer Army, led by SS General Sepp Dietrich, packed with elite Waffen-SS Panzer divisions. In the center, General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army aimed directly at the American heart of the line. To the south, the 7th Army under General Erich Brandenberger was tasked with securing the flank. Secrecy was absolute. Movements took place only at night. Soldiers were warned to remain silent about their mission. Fuel and ammunition were stockpiled in hidden dumps. The Luftwaffe, though greatly diminished, prepared to give cover once weather allowed. Hitler himself believed the surprise would rival that of 1940, a sudden, devastating blow from the least expected direction. On December 16, 1944, before dawn, the offensive erupted. German artillery thundered across a 50-mile front, shaking the forests. Thousands of shells rained down on thinly stretched American lines. Then came the armored spearheads, Tigers, Panthers, and Stugs, rolling out of the mist. Entire U.S. divisions, unprepared and poorly equipped for winter war, were overrun. Roads clogged with retreating vehicles, broken equipment, and refugees fleeing west. American commanders were stunned. The Allies had assumed Germany was too weak to launch such an attack. Instead, they now faced a massive armored thrust that punched deep into their lines, creating a swelling bulge on the map. Hence the name, Battle of the Bulge. For the Germans, speed was everything. The advance had to reach the Meuse within days before Allied reinforcements and air power could regroup. And to do that, control of the road network was vital. Every army needs crossroads, places where supplies, reinforcements, and movement converge. In the Ardennes, one town held the most important junction, Bastogne. It was small, barely 4,000 residents, but 7 major roads converged there. Whoever controlled Bastogne could control movement across the southern half of the German advance. For Hitler's generals, seizing Bastogne was essential. For the Americans, holding it became a matter of survival. As German spearheads raced west, Bastogne suddenly emerged from obscurity into the very center of the campaign. For the American command, the first days of the German offensive were chaos. Reports flooded in from shattered frontline units, each describing breakthroughs, collapsing sectors, and German armor appearing where no one expected it. By December 18th, the scale of the disaster was clear. This was not a local attack, but a full-scale offensive. Eisenhower and his commanders had to react with speed, or risk losing the initiative in Europe. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, recognized at once that Bastogne was the pivot point. 7 vital roads radiated from the town, allowing movement north to Liège, west to the Meuse, and south toward Arles. If Bastogne fell into German hands, the 5th Panzer Army under General von Lüttwitz could surge west unchecked. If Bastogne held, it would choke German logistics and slow the entire advance. Bradley turned to one of the most reliable units in the U.S. Army, the 101st Airborne Division. They were elite paratroopers, veterans of Normandy and Operation Market Garden. Though depleted and still recovering from earlier battles, their reputation for toughness was unquestioned. On December 18th, Eisenhower ordered them to move with all speed toward Bastogne. Trucks were requisitioned, and the division, roughly 11,000 men under the acting command of Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, began its rushed march toward the crossroads. The timing was desperate. German armor was already pushing toward Bastogne, and only fragments of U.S. units, combat engineers, tank destroyers, and stragglers from broken divisions were in place to resist. On the morning of December 19th, the 101st began arriving, weary and ill-equipped for a winter siege. They had little heavy artillery, no tanks of their own, and almost no winter clothing. Many still wore the same uniforms they had carried since Holland, with thin jackets and worn boots, completely inadequate for the sub-zero nights of the Ardennes, but they arrived in time. By the evening of December 19th, the 101st Airborne had taken up defensive positions around the town. Small groups dug foxholes in the frozen ground, stringing out along the perimeter to cover every approach. They were reinforced by elements of the 10th Armored Division, whose tanks and crews added vital firepower. The defenders numbered only about 18,000 men in total, against more than 50,000 Germans advancing toward them. For McAuliffe, the mission was stark: hold Bastogne at all costs. His calm leadership, combined with the professionalism of his paratroopers, set the tone. Orders went out to prepare for encirclement. Supply lines were already under threat. Snowstorms grounded Allied aircraft. Artillery ammunition was rationed. Still, the 101st began constructing a ring of defense, spreading thinly around the town's perimeter. As German spearheads reached the outskirts, Bastogne became the hinge of the entire southern front. If it fell quickly, von Lüttwitz's divisions could pour westward. If it held, German timetables would collapse. In the coming days, the paratroopers would face wave after wave of German attacks, cut off from relief, surrounded by armor and artillery, fighting in conditions that seemed unbearable. Yet inside the frozen town, morale hardened. Bastogne was not just another position. It was the line between the Allies and a renewed German hope of victory. The siege was about to begin. The siege of Bastogne was not defined solely by maps and military orders. To understand it, one must step closer and into the mud, the cold, and the lives of those trapped within the tightening German ring. For the men of the 101st Airborne, Bastogne became a test of human endurance as much as of military skill. They were seasoned soldiers, veterans of airborne drops into Normandy and Holland, but nothing had prepared them for the relentless cold of the Ardennes winter. Many lacked gloves, overshoes, and even adequate coats. Frostbite spread quickly, turning feet numb and blackened. Rations were meager: a few biscuits, tinned meat, or whatever could be scavenged from the frozen countryside. At times, men boiled snow for water, then drank from helmets, shivering in silence as artillery thumped in the distance. Their foxholes offered little comfort. The ground was iron-hard, frozen solid beneath a crust of snow. Each shell that landed sent showers of dirt and ice into the air, cutting faces, stinging eyes. Sleep came in short, broken fragments, interrupted by the crack of rifle fire or the whine of incoming shells. Yet the men endured, because endurance was the only option. At the center of this ordeal was Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the acting commander of the 101st. He had inherited command while General Maxwell Taylor was away in the United States. Calm, approachable, and quietly confident, McAuliffe became a symbol of steadiness when the situation could have collapsed into despair. His headquarters, established in a simple building in Bastogne, became the nerve center of the defense. McAuliffe was not given to fiery speeches. Instead, he led with composure. His paratroopers knew he shared their hardships, moving constantly between command posts, encouraging frontline units, listening to their concerns. His calm tone reassured his officers. They were not abandoned. They were holding something vital, and the outside world knew it. That sense of purpose sustained morale in ways ammunition could not. Amid the soldiers stood the civilians, men, women, and children of the Belgian town caught in the crossfire of one of the war's most brutal battles. For them, Bastogne was not a strategic crossroads, but their home. Many had already fled when the Germans advanced, but thousands remained. Their lives were thrown into the siege alongside the soldiers. Basements became shelters. Families huddled beneath stone floors as shells shattered windows above. Children clung to mothers as artillery rolled across the sky. Some civilians offered help to the paratroopers, cooking what little food they had, sharing wine or bread, or guiding soldiers through the maze of narrow streets. Others simply endured, praying the town would survive the inferno closing in on all sides. For both soldier and civilian, Bastogne became a crucible of endurance. In those frozen days, survival itself was victory, but endurance alone would not determine the outcome. Beyond the human element lay the hard calculations of warfare, tactics, technology, and the psychological battle of willpower. If the human struggle at Bastogne revealed courage and endurance, the tactical and technological dimensions showed how fragile that courage could have been. Without Bastogne's significance was not in its size, but in its roads. 7 major routes radiated outward like spokes from a wheel. For the Germans, those roads were arteries for tanks and supply columns. For the Americans, denying those routes was the entire point of the defense. McAuliffe's men created a perimeter around the town, a thin ring, stretched too far for the numbers available. Each sector was assigned to a regiment, with outposts covering likely tank approaches. The lines were not solid walls but elastic defenses, designed to slow and bleed German assaults. The defenders rotated positions constantly, moving artillery to mask weakness, laying mines where armor might break through, and using bazookas to ambush tanks in narrow defiles. The Germans launched attacks from multiple directions, probing for weakness. Each assault was met with stubborn resistance. The Americans lacked manpower, but they traded space for time, retreating only when necessary, then reforming behind makeshift barricades. Tactical improvisation became the order of the day, and Bastogne's defenders mastered it. The siege also highlighted the technological imbalance. German forces fielded Panthers, Tigers, and heavy artillery, weapons designed to smash through prepared defenses. Against them, the 101st relied on lighter Shermans from the 10th Armored Division, 105mm howitzers, and portable weapons like bazookas. On paper, it was no contest. In practice, terrain and ingenuity helped level the field. The Ardennes' dense forests restricted tank movement, forcing German armor into predictable avenues of attack. American artillery, though limited in shells, was used with ruthless efficiency. Fire was concentrated on road junctions, villages, and assembly areas. Each round mattered, and forward observers called fire with precision born of desperation. Perhaps most decisive was the sky above. For the first week of the siege, thick snow and fog grounded Allied aircraft. Supplies could not be dropped, and close air support was impossible. The defenders grew weaker each day, their ammunition dwindling. Then on December 23rd, the skies cleared. Waves of C-47 transport planes roared overhead, dropping bundles of food, medical supplies, and ammunition by parachute. Soon after, Allied fighter bombers prowled the skies, strafing German columns and smashing armor with rockets. Technology, once muted by weather, turned the tide. Bastogne was also a war of nerves. Encircled, outnumbered, and battered by artillery, the 101st faced not just physical threats but mental exhaustion. German loudspeakers blared propaganda, promising destruction and urging surrender. Shells rained down on the town at all hours, ensuring no rest was complete. Frostbite, hunger, and the sight of wounded comrades tested morale constantly. But the paratroopers clung to a fierce pride. They were airborne, elite, tested in the harshest battles of the war. The word surrender was unthinkable. McAuliffe's refusal of the German ultimatum, summed up in the single immortal word, nuts, captured that defiance. It became more than a retort. It was a rallying cry, proof that morale could not be broken by encirclement or hardship. For the Germans, the psychological pressure cut the other way. Each day that Bastogne held meant timetable slipping, supplies draining, and the Meuse further from reach. What was supposed to be a rapid thrust turned into a grinding siege against a stubborn pocket of resistance. German disbelief grew. How could such a small force resist the weight of divisions pressing on every side? The answer lay in a combination of human endurance, tactical improvisation, and psychological defiance. But even defiance has limits. The climax came when the Germans demanded surrender, expecting the Americans to finally break. Instead, they received a reply that would enter history. By December 22, 1944, Bastogne was a fortress under fire. German artillery rained down daily, pulverizing houses, churches, and barns. Smoke clung to the air above the town, and each road was littered with burned-out vehicles. Ammunition was nearly gone. Medical supplies were exhausted. Hundreds of wounded men lay in basements and makeshift hospitals, with no heat and no morphine to dull their agony. The Germans believed the moment had come. That morning, under a white flag, 4 German officers approached American lines. They carried a formal message, signed by General Heinrich von Lüttwitz, commander of the German Ex-Alpine Panzer Corps. It offered the Americans honorable terms of surrender. Failure to comply, the message warned, would result in the total annihilation of the encircled garrison by overwhelming artillery and armored forces. The letter was delivered to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe at his headquarters. Surrounded by staff officers, McAuliffe read the message aloud. His immediate reaction was disbelief, followed by irritation. Searching for words, he muttered a single phrase that captured his thoughts. Nuts. His staff laughed. When told he needed to draft a formal reply, McAuliffe insisted on sending that single word. The typed response was handed back to the German officers, who left bewildered, unsure what it meant until an interpreter explained. That single word became legend. To the Americans, it summed up their defiance. To the Germans, it was a stunning rejection. They had expected surrender. Instead, they faced a garrison that refused to yield no matter the odds. The Germans answered not with negotiation but with violence. Throughout December 22 and into December 23, assaults came from multiple directions. Tanks pushed down icy roads, infantry advanced through the woods, and artillery pounded the perimeter. Each attack met with furious resistance. American bazooka teams stalked Panthers, hitting them from close range. Artillery, though rationed, was concentrated on choke points. Machine guns rattled from frozen foxholes as paratroopers held their lines yard by yard. In villages like Marvy and Himrola, fighting raged from house to house. German tanks rolled into streets, only to be ambushed at point-blank range by American gunners. Snow turned black with smoke, then red with blood. Neither side gave ground easily. Inside Bastogne, the situation grew critical. Ammunition was being counted shell by shell. Wounded men froze in unheated shelters. Civilians prayed for relief, and yet morale remained intact. The nuts reply had hardened the resolve of every man in the division. If their commander would not surrender, neither would they. For the Germans, the frustration mounted. Each assault failed to break the perimeter. Each hour lost meant Allied reinforcements drawing closer. The clock that Hitler had set for his Ardennes gamble was ticking away. Bastogne was not collapsing. It was holding. And then, as if nature itself shifted allegiance, the skies began to clear. The morning of December 23, 1944, dawned differently over Bastogne. For days, a heavy ceiling of cloud and snow had locked the defenders in isolation, cutting off any hope of resupply. Now at last, the skies broke open into a crisp blue. For the men of the 101st Airborne, it was as though the world itself had shifted in their favor. By mid-morning, the distant drone of engines grew louder, until the sky was filled with the silhouettes of C-47 transport aircraft. They came in waves, braving German anti-aircraft fire to drop desperately needed supplies, food, blankets, medical kits, and most importantly, ammunition. Parachutes bloomed above the town like blossoms in the winter sky, drifting down into fields and streets. Soldiers scrambled to recover every bundle, hauling crates back to positions on sleds and jeeps. The effect was immediate. Artillery crews fired with new confidence, infantrymen reloaded with renewed vigor, and morale soared. The siege had not been broken, but survival no longer felt impossible. And then came the next shift. Allied fighter bombers, released from the grip of bad weather, swept over the Ardennes. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings dived on German convoys, shredding supply lines, torching fuel depots, and hammering armor columns trying to reinforce the siege. For the German commanders who had counted on weeks of overcast skies to shield their offensive, this was a devastating blow. Air power had returned to the battlefield, and it belonged entirely to the Allies. Still, Bastogne was not yet safe. German pressure continued, with renewed attacks on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. In villages around the perimeter, furious clashes erupted as German tanks tried once more to break through. American defenders clung stubbornly to their foxholes, bolstered by the precious supplies from above but still dangerously thin on manpower. Each night the horizon flared with artillery duels, and each day German units probed for weakness. Relief, however, was on the way. Far to the south, General George S. Patton had executed one of the most remarkable maneuvers of the war. In a matter of days, he had wheeled his entire Third Army northward, pivoting from an eastward advance into Germany to a desperate drive toward Bastogne. It was a logistical feat few believed possible. Divisions turned, refueled, and marched through snow-covered roads, fighting as they advanced. Patton's reputation for speed and audacity had never been more evident. On December 26th, spearheads of the 4th Armored Division finally broke through German lines south of Bastogne. A single Sherman tank, with infantry clinging to its hull, rolled into the battered town by evening. For the encircled paratroopers, the sight was almost surreal. Bastogne was no longer cut off. The ring had been pierced. The siege was not over. Fighting would continue for weeks as German forces tried to retighten the noose. But the moment of greatest peril had passed. The 101st Airborne, surrounded, starving, freezing, had held the crossroads against overwhelming odds until relief arrived. For the Germans, disbelief turned to despair. What was meant to be a swift capture had become a costly stalemate. The most critical resource in Hitler's Ardennes gamble, had been lost, and Bastogne, the crossroads they needed, remained firmly in American hands. The turning point of the battle had been reached. When Patton's armored columns broke the encirclement on December 26th, the town of Bastogne was not liberated in the traditional sense. It was simply reconnected to the outside world. The 101st Airborne and their supporting units remained in place, still surrounded by enemy forces on multiple sides, still enduring shell fire and counterattacks. But the worst danger, total isolation, had been lifted. The defenders had survived the most perilous phase of the siege. The physical cost was staggering. Much of Bastogne lay in ruins. Stone houses were reduced to shells, churches gutted, entire neighborhoods flattened by artillery. Civilian survivors emerged from cellars into a landscape of rubble and twisted steel. For the soldiers, the town had been transformed into a fortress of rubble and frozen earthworks. Streets were lined with destroyed vehicles, the carcasses of horses, and the unburied dead. The casualties told the story of endurance under fire. Within Bastogne, American forces had suffered more than 3,000 killed, wounded, or missing during the siege. Frostbite and exposure accounted for hundreds more. German losses, though difficult to tally, were far heavier. Estimates suggest more than 7,000 killed and wounded in repeated failed assaults against the perimeter, along with dozens of tanks destroyed by bazookas, artillery, and airstrikes once the skies cleared. Strategically, the failure to take Bastogne was catastrophic for the German plan. Hitler's timetable required rapid seizure of key objectives, including the Meuse crossings, before Allied reinforcements could arrive. Bastogne's crossroads were essential for moving armor westward. Instead, the German advance stalled, supply columns choked, and momentum evaporated. Every day spent battering the town was a day lost in the race to Antwerp. For the Allies, the defense of Bastogne became a rallying point. Newspapers in the United States and Britain hailed the stand of the battered bastards of Bastogne, a phrase soldiers of the 101st wore with pride. Within the U.S. Army, The defense became a symbol of determination. General Eisenhower himself noted that the stubborn stand at Bastogne bought precious time for reinforcements to arrive, stabilizing the front and turning the tide of the Ardennes battle. Yet for those who fought there, glory was tempered by exhaustion. The men of the 101st had not seen themselves as legends. They had simply obeyed orders, digging into frozen ground and refusing to yield. Relief brought no rest, only the grim knowledge that the siege was not entirely over. German forces remained close, and the fighting in the Ardennes would rage on into January. Still, the symbolism was undeniable. A German corps had failed to crush an isolated American division. A supposedly overwhelming offensive had been blunted by grit and endurance, and the myth of German invincibility, already fading, suffered another devastating blow in the snows of Belgium. Bastogne had been held, but the cost was still unfolding. The siege of Bastogne did not end with fireworks or fanfare. It ended with the slow, grinding realization that the German offensive had failed. By early January 1945, the Ardennes Offensive, Hitler's last gamble in the West, was collapsing under its own weight. Fuel shortages, overwhelming Allied air power, and relentless counterattacks forced German divisions back toward their starting lines. What was meant to be a decisive blow became instead a costly retreat. At the center of that collapse stood Bastogne. The fact that the 101st Airborne had held the crossroads against overwhelming odds carried a weight far beyond the tactical. It became a symbol of American resilience. Soldiers who had frozen in foxholes, survived on meager rations, and faced tanks with little more than bazookas now carried the reputation of being unbreakable. Within weeks, the phrase "the 101st held Bastogne" spread across Allied lines and into the public consciousness back home. General Patton, whose Third Army had fought desperately to relieve the siege, paid tribute in his own way. Though he received credit for the daring maneuver that broke the encirclement, he acknowledged the true heroes were those who had endured inside. Eisenhower, too, recognized that Bastogne's defense had bought the Allies critical time, preventing a split of their armies and protecting Antwerp. For the Germans, Bastogne was a bitter lesson. Their commanders had believed that a rapid armored thrust could seize the town within days. Instead, they encountered an American division that refused to bend. The disbelief among German soldiers grew with each failed assault. How could a force so heavily outnumbered, so poorly supplied, resist for so long? Their failure at Bastogne epitomized the broader failure of the Ardennes Offensive. What was supposed to be swift and decisive became slow, costly, and ultimately doomed. The human cost remained immense. Bastogne itself was left shattered. Civilians returned to homes reduced to rubble. Survivors told stories of nights spent in cellars, of hunger and fear, of watching their town become a battlefield. The scars of the siege lasted long after the guns fell silent. For the 101st, the battle entered their identity. The division already carried fame from Normandy and Holland, but Bastogne elevated them to near mythic status. They had been surrounded, isolated, and nearly destroyed, yet they held. Veterans carried that legacy with pride, even as they mourned the comrades who had not survived. In the broader war, Bastogne marked a turning point. The German gamble in the Ardennes had consumed their last reserves of manpower and fuel. Never again would the Wehrmacht mount an offensive of that scale in the West. The failure sealed the fate of the Reich, accelerating the Allied drive into Germany that would end in Berlin just months later. Bastogne was not the largest battle of the war. It was not the bloodiest, but it became one of the most remembered, precisely because of its symbolism. Surrounded, outnumbered, starved, and freezing, the 101st Airborne had defied annihilation. Their stand reminded the world that wars are not won only by numbers or machines, but by the will of those who refuse to surrender. The Germans could not believe it. Yet history records it clearly. Bastogne held. The story of Bastogne is more than the tale of a town under siege. It is a reminder of how history often turns on moments of endurance, when men, battered and exhausted, hold their ground not because victory seems possible, but because giving way is unthinkable. In December 1944, the 101st Airborne was not equipped for glory. They were hungry, cold, and surrounded. They lacked tanks, heavy artillery, and proper winter clothing. Many of their wounded lay untreated, many of their dead unburied. Yet when the Germans demanded surrender, their answer was not calculation but defiance. One word: nuts. came to symbolize an unbreakable will. For the Allies, Bastogne became proof that determination could outlast even the fiercest offensive. The siege delayed German timetables, drained their strength, and bought the Allies time to regroup. More than that, it gave soldiers across the front a symbol. If Bastogne could hold, so could they. For the Germans, the disbelief lingered. They had unleashed one of their last great efforts of the war, only to be checked by a single division clinging to a crossroads in the snow. The failure at Bastogne echoed through the rest of the Ardennes campaign, a reminder that momentum can vanish when resolve refuses to break. In the decades since, Bastogne has become sacred ground. Monuments stand where foxholes once froze. Veterans have returned to remember comrades who did not leave those forests alive. And the name itself has entered the language of history. Bastogne, the place where the surrounded refused to surrender. The siege reminds us that war is not only about weapons and numbers. It is about human beings placed in impossible conditions choosing to stand firm. In Bastogne, the 101st Airborne showed that resolve can outlast even the harshest winter, even the heaviest fire, even the certainty of defeat. The crossroads held. And in holding, they helped shape the end of the war in Europe.